Welcome, Professor Angela O'Hagan to Sterling University, and thank you again for taking time to deliver the keynote for us today at our Minority and Indigenous Rights Conference. We will explore some few themes coming out of your keynote this morning. But before that, I just want to ask you, how are you settling in your role after 6 months as chair of the Scottish Human Rights Commission?
Indeed. No, thank you very, very much. It was a really lovely invitation and to be part of this morning's conference, a great learning opportunity. And I think helps contextualise the global nature of what we're all engaged in, but how that can manifest at the very local level. This is the job of a lifetime, really. It's the biggest job of my life, but it is also, I think, the culmination of a career of a professional and activist interest in and around equalities and human rights work throughout my career. The Commission is small, as I've said. We don't have a huge amount of staff resource or financial resource, but we are pretty mighty, or hoping to be pretty mighty within our restricted mandate as well. We have a number of very important limitations on what we can do. And so then the challenge and the art is, how do you make the most of what you can do? And that's where we have a really exciting strategic plan. I know exciting and strategic plan don't normally go together in sentences, but I think it is a really exciting plan because it is absolutely focused around recognising the humanity of the person standing beside you. So across our thinking, it's about people, purpose and performance. So how are we bearing witness to human rights experience in Scotland? How are we amplifying the voices of people? How are we delivering on our purpose to raise awareness, to promote human rights? And are we performing in the way that stakeholders, the public in the first instance, and Parliament as our sponsoring body, if you like. So it's been a very quick 6 months. In that time, I've come into the report launches and follow up on places of detention, on the production and publishing of our economic, social and cultural rights work in the Highlands and Islands, and then our work on coming home, on deinstitutionalisation of people with severe learning disabilities and or who are autistic. So very different issues across rights domains that we're working to in quite different and quite innovative ways, not just for the Commission, but more widely. There's been a lot of international interest in the economic, social and cultural rights work, where we've taken the content of the International Covenant of Economic, Social and Cultural Rights, the recommendations from the SESCR committee, and applied that in a framework to then assess our evidence of the enjoyment or denials of those rights in the Highlands and Islands. And that then provides a framework for duty bearers, for public services, to have a look at how they can and should be improving. And that methodology and approach is going to be rolled out around the country over the lifetime of our strategic plan. So we'll be travelling around different parts of Scotland. And I think that is a very different way of working for the Commission. So in the short time that I've been there and having the enormous privilege, not just to be in the service of the people of Scotland, but the privilege to front this really fantastic work coming out of the team. And it's the first time that we've seen a report from the Scottish Human Rights Commission be the focus of a members' motion and a full debate in the Scottish Parliament. The committees are picking up on our deinstitutionalisation report and on our Highlands and Islands report. So getting that traction also reflects how we have pivoted the work with a shift away from a focus on our advisory function being to government and the webs of advisory groups and working groups and to pivot to Parliament, to support the knowledge building in Parliament in order to improve the scrutiny by Parliament. If we take the concept of Parliament in our context being the ultimate guarantor of human rights in Scotland, then parliamentarians need to be better informed. They need to be holding duty bearers to account far more effectively and with far more authority than we can, given our current mandate.
Yeah, I think that's really important. And you kind of have a lot on your plate that you're doing with very limited resources. And I know at the conference this morning you spoke about our Human Rights Matters, the report that you have put together as part of the commission and other reports that you have put together. I thought just moving a little bit to the theme of the conference and your talk around the challenges and the work that you're doing in relation to the Gypsy travel community in Scotland. I wonder if you could unpack that just quickly for our listeners in terms of the major issues that you see that community facing, and in terms of the work that you're also doing in the commission to be able to address some of those issues, and in particular your view around the public apology and the pressure on the government for that. I wonder what you can say more about that.
Okay. Our Human Rights Matter was actually a community-based report, one of a number of community reports that have been produced by different communities of Scottish Gypsy travellers, most often with the support of Making Rights Real, a really fantastic and totally underfunded civil society organisation, as is very often the case. Scottish Gypsy travellers have traditionally experienced some of the most brutal and institutionalised discrimination in Scotland, sanctioned by previous governments, implemented by governments and the Church of Scotland, as we were hearing this morning. The media and press in Scotland have traditionally fueled that discrimination and antagonism towards the Gypsy traveller community. How the discrimination manifests, again, traditionally forced assimilation, forced separation of families, forced schooling, and we see that carry right through to people's everyday experiences and the impact, the lasting legacy of what was called the Tinker experiment. Now, anything with a community and experiment in the word should rightly give us shivers, I think. And what we were hearing this morning about eugenicists being involved in the 30s and 40s, a deliberate, concerted effort across the powerful institutions of church and state to eradicate a community, not just their identity, but to eradicate that community by forced separation. So obviously people are still living that legacy in terms of their own family relations and their own physical and mental health. But they're also living that legacy in terms of the inappropriate, culturally inappropriate and the inadequate accommodation that people have. And that we're seeing that right up to the present day, despite there being some funds allocated by some local authorities to support adaptation and improvement on registered sites. That's been a really difficult process for the communities, and another example of where trust in public authorities has completely broken down because of how Gypsy travellers are treated by public institutions. One of the recent things that has happened is not just the Commission being involved and coming in underneath the community-based research around the Tinker experiment, but is to analyse and coordinate the analysis around what is the legal redress here, what scope could the calls for a public apology or calls for public redress take. So we're engaged in that analytical work at the moment, as well as supporting the development of a victims archive and community-led research there. But we're also seeing, again, through the work of Making Rights Real, supporting communities, the engagement of the Scottish Housing Regulator, which has been a really significant breakthrough. They're using their new powers. So residents have brought forward their issues to the Housing Regulator, who've used their power or function of issuing a serious concern notice. This language sounds weak, but it's very important because it is a direct sort of accountability mechanism that can then tie local authorities into improvement plans and require the local authority to work with the community to ensure that what they said they were going to do is going to happen. So it's a very long-running shame on Scotland and on Scotland's institutions. And it's a very real and everyday experience for the communities. So the Commission has a responsibility in terms of bearing witness to such rights violations and to amplify voices of most marginalised communities. So I think it's very exciting work for the Commission. It's work that needs to be approached with an absolute commitment to participation, to sensitivity, and to respect for rights holders. And I think fair play to the Commission for engaging in it.
That's great. I think just before my colleague comes in terms of place in Scotland in the global context as well, if I could just follow up a bit around that aspect of the work you're doing around the apology for the historic injustice, if you want to say a bit about that.
So we're effectively scoping out what are the legal standards, what legal frameworks, and within them, what is the evidence meeting the legal threshold for cultural genocide? What are the legal frameworks that are in play? What mechanism for redress and apology would be most appropriate? So we're able to do that legal analysis. Obviously, any decision is with the communities, but we're trying to provide some of that legal analysis to support the community.
Great, thank you for that.
Thank you very much. We have this wonderful privilege of hosting this conference on minority and Indigenous rights with participants, advocates, and academics from around the world. Yeah. And many of them are representing their own Indigenous and minority communities and have been engaged in advocacy, serving in various NGOs and commissions as well. And I was just wondering, how do you see your work or the Commission's work embedded in these transnational networks? What level of solidarity, either institutionalized forms of it or just more spontaneously, do you see as part of your work, part of the Commission's work? Are there sort of collaborative initiatives? What might be new ways we might think about joining some of our efforts, which are some of the things you've mentioned are echoed in so many of the talks and so many of the testimonies that we're hearing through these 2.5 days of conference with dispossession, like of identity rights, children's predicament, etc. So what are some of the maybe international, transnational dimensions of your work?
I think, first of all, congratulations on putting together the conference. It's hugely interesting, and you have such a range of experience in the room. I've only just seen a couple of presentations, which I think set into context. I mean, I focused on the Indigenous communities of Scotland and particularly Gypsy travellers. But what we're seeing are the commonalities, different scales perhaps, when we look at the numbers of people who've been killed or displaced through state-sponsored actions. But nonetheless, that is the common thread from what I've heard this morning, from what I was talking about this morning, is that state-sponsored, institutionally led, direct assault on the rights of communities and of individuals. And I think seeing ourselves, as a little tiny country on the northern periphery of Europe, but I think nonetheless having an internationalist perspective, which Scotland has always done, and so recognising that we are part of a global struggle, we're part of a global system which manifests differently at different country levels. It reinforces the need for the rule of law. It reinforces the need for well-functioning democratic institutions. And I would argue that a well-resourced, well-functioning national human rights institution is part of that. And that's where we can bring solidarity as well to countries where that structure is not possible or supported or is directly under attack. And in terms of attack, we are seeing with breathtaking speed the attacks on data, on the concepts that we hold dear in the human rights community of dignity, respect, non-discrimination, seriously being under attack. And again, the institutional supports for advancing the realisation of rights being systematically undermined through the removal of academic data, through the assaults on diversity, equality and inclusion, and the withdrawal of international cooperation and development funding, and that the followership that is provoking is deeply worrying. I think that raises challenges for us in the international human rights community to withstand and to argue back. And that starts with public awareness as well, and it starts with our students as well as to why are human rights important? Human rights are not this other or for somebody else. They're about everyone's everyday lives. And I think particularly my experience in Scotland would suggest that human rights are seen as something a bit foreign, a bit othered, rather than, and somehow or other only in service or function of deviant behaviours. So prisoners, why do we talk about prisoner rights? Well, surely the the measure of any society is in how we treat our prisoners. But there's a rejection of that philosophy, I think, or that approach in the general sort of mindset. And we see that then manifest in public authorities who think, oh, human rights, well, we've got all of these other things to do, and then you want us to think about human rights. And so I spend my life saying human rights is a way of thinking and doing. It's a starting point. If you're in public service, whether that's the health service or a local council or whatever, start from thinking about how do we secure not just our legal obligations, but the outcomes that are rights realisations for people. The international comparisons are enormously useful in that regard, both in terms of holding up where there are human rights violations and pointing to how they may be addressed, but also looking to good practice internationally. I think the work, obviously, of the UN is central here, but also through the treaty monitoring cycles. I'm just back from the CESCR committee in Geneva and was enormously impressed by the capacity of the committee who do this work pro bono. They are interrogating multiple countries at the time. The depth of their knowledge is incredible. So when students think, oh my goodness, how much more do we have to read? Think about the committee who had 72 submissions from civil society organisations, plus the government submissions, plus NHRIs, National Human Rights Institutions. And the level of detail they were asking in their questions was just phenomenal. But seeing how what can seem very remote through the global processes seem remote and slow, that my perceptions of that were really challenged when Making Rights Real or Scottish Gypsy Travellers were participating in the hybrid sessions. Small local groups like Castle Milk Housing Group had submitted their evidence to the committee, and you can see that the committee have read that and they're using that to inform their questions of government. There is a much closer accountability than I think even we have at the domestic level, and that's why we need to see Parliament strengthened in that way. What we also as an NHRI benefit from is our membership of the Global Alliance of National Human Rights Institutions and the European Network. And again, I have the enormous privilege to be going back to Geneva next week for the General Assembly. I can't wait. My brain will be leaking out my ears at the end of 3 days of fantastic input and learning about the institutional and organisational challenges, the challenges for NHRIs in different political contexts. And what we heard in the European network in the autumn are the commonality of challenges as well. The disregard for human rights in public discourse, the limitations of parliamentary time and parliamentary engagement, the limitations of the resource of NHRIs. So there are some very significant challenges. So we need to grow the community, and we need to grow the community with all the fabulous students coming through your own programme. And I previously introduced and ran the Masters in Human Rights at Glasgow Caledonian University. So we do need this fresh blood to come in to all of this.
So I think that's really important, and you kind of referenced earlier in your keynote today about some of the work that you're doing around incorporation of human rights standards into Scots law. And I think within the UK as well, Scotland is taking an important lead in that regard, despite some of the challenges that devolution itself poses on that. But I think it was really great to explore that theme in the last conference we held at Stirling on human rights and incorporation. But speaking about some of the challenges, and I recall one of your frustrations around the keynote today was in relation to action plans and numerous action plans and that problem of compliance and implementation, which is a really important problem across the board in relation to human rights. I wonder if you could say a bit more about that.
I think there's twofold there, really. One is about improving the base knowledge, the basic knowledge, to then improve the discourse on human rights. And then we might move better from planning to action. Because what we've seen certainly in Scotland over the last decades is absolutely sincere efforts to address the question of incorporation through First Minister's task forces, through leadership groups, and then a whole complex web of working groups and advisory groups, and the Scottish National Action Plan on Human Rights Mark II, and the participation panels, all well intended, but that the consequence, or the result of that rather, was that the Scottish Government in September last year did not introduce the Human Rights Incorporation Bill as committed to. And the consequence of that has been a huge breach of trust with civil society organisations, particularly, who I would say have done the heavy lifting on the campaigning for human rights incorporation. One of the positive consequences of that has been a hugely well-informed, the development of knowledge across civil society organisations in Scotland around human rights. Unfortunately, that's now being undermined by the fight for survival for many organisations as funding cuts start to bite, and the funding mechanisms that are in place are not suited to supporting sustainability and longevity of civil society organisations, which in turn has meant a lot of distrust and stepping away from these mechanisms with the Scottish Government. My personal view is that the Scottish Government have said they've withdrawn from the Human Rights Bill for the moment, and that this is a pre-implementation period, and they are committed to bringing forward a Human Rights Bill in the next Parliament. Well, firstly, a sitting government, an incumbent government, cannot commit a future government to legislation. It's still to win an election, and then see what they're going to do with a full parliamentary term, which they already had the last time. But now we have potentially quite a depleted civil society input there as well. And the other thing you touched on there is some of the constitutional difficulties around incorporation. And that's meant to be part of the focus of this pre-implementation period, whereby the Scottish and UK governments are working together on those legal and constitutional challenges. I fear that there's a lack of pace and impetus around that. When I hear phrases like there has been an exchange of letters, it makes me think of Mary Queen of Scots and Elizabeth I, and I hear the thundering of hooves through the night to exchange saddlebags at the border. That we really could be seeing a lot more speeding up. But I think that raises very interesting questions in the UK context in relation to a UK Labour government committed to the rule of law and human rights, but how far does that extend into devolution and the protection of the United Kingdom? So we do clash. We are coming up against these constitutional questions, and then not least through different interpretations of the esteemed Supreme Court.
Thank you very much for that. Before we wrap up, we do run the Human Rights Master's Program, the Master's Program in Human Rights and Diplomacy. And as you referenced earlier on, not just in Stirling, but in many Scottish universities, we do have a range of future students coming up, and future practitioners in relation to human rights. And Dr. Frenya has some questions around students and careers.
Right, just sort of, you've laid out so well the stakes of why human rights matter and why they should be of interest to our students, not just at the master's level, but also our undergraduate students. And we are seeing this in our classrooms beyond the law setting. The students are realizing in contemporary times how much taken for granted rights, potentially their own, related to their own identity, their own livelihoods, might be up for litigation, up for debate, up for grabs, and not as solid as they thought it were. For any of them who might be thinking of, or not even thinking of, but potentially might consider a career in human rights or advocacy along those lines, what words of advice you might have, encouragement and advice from the strategic to the higher order?
Sure. Well, I think stick with it, and to see human rights across multiple settings, that human rights are ingrained in, or should be, in our everyday lives. And so if you're interested in a career in public policy, whether that's in transport or health or public planning and infrastructure, take a human rights-based approach to that, and a whole new world opens up to you if you start from that rights-based approach. How to secure that realisation, how might things be different, rather than that bolt-on afterwards, which has become, I think, the norm in practice in terms of human rights impact assessment, equality impact assessment. They tend to be bolt-ons rather than integrated. So seeing that the application, seeing human rights in a very applied setting, I think is really important. And then it opens up much more, many more horizons to you as a student. And I think you touched on it very clearly there, Edith, about taking for granted. And I think what we're seeing is that, and I say this as 30 years into my career in all of this, that I think many of the rights which we had assumed had been secured, have they been sufficiently protected? Did we think we would have had to protect them as much as we clearly do now? And that the challenge to rights is coming from some unexpected places as well. And so I think being alert to that, not taking for granted, and taking a much more universalist view, I think is really important. I think there are important questions too around framing rights in terms of the balance of rights, that we need to be careful around all of that, and maintain a universalist perspective, and a perspective that the ultimate, the foundational principle here is, a life of dignity and respect for all, and hold that front and centre, whether you are a human rights law student, or you're a public policy student, or you're a health policy student. What is being proposed going to secure the dignity, autonomy and respect for the individual? And if not, you're the one that has to change it.
Thank you so much for taking the time to really speak to us today, and to be a really important voice. And it's an absolute pleasure to really have you contribute to our Human Rights podcast series at the University of Stirling. And we wish you good luck with the real work you're doing, the important work you're doing to make a real difference in the lives of people in Scotland. So thank you again very much.
Thank you very much. I'm so interested in the programme, and I think this is a fantastic initiative, the Human Rights Journal, and all the different elements that you've put together. So really well done. And myself or anyone from the Commission would be very happy to come back and engage in your work. So
we'll certainly take you on that offer.
Thank you very much.
Thank you very much.
No problem.
Okay.